Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. I hate to break up lively discussion. Thank you. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Canadian Senator Wanda Bernard. She's a distinguished Canadian leader and advocate for social justice and inclusion. As a trailblazer and visionary, she has dedicated her expertise in social work, education, and policy to advancing the rights and opportunities of underrepresented communities across our country. Her leadership has been instrumental in shaping national policy discourse on a range of critical issues. I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to her for moderating a deeper conversation with our international policy experts. Her skillful facilitation will create meaningful and engaging discussion that will shed light on how these policies have actually impacted the lives of autistic people and their families in these countries. We would also like to keep Summit as interactive as possible. After lunch, you will be given an opportunity to ask our experts questions that you may have. There's a QR code for Slido. If any of you need help with that, our staff are available to help you access that, where you can post questions that we will then ask to our panelists. So thank you so much. And Senator Bernard, I'll let you take it away.
So much. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with these three outstanding international leaders on the work that's so important to everyone who's gathered here in this space today. And we hope that, we want to try to make this as engaging as possible. You've all been listening for a long time, and we want to do a little deeper dive into some of the issues. And one of the first issues that I want to do a deeper dive into is actually the issue that you've all raised, the importance of engagement with what I call first voices, but engagement with autistic people in the development of policy, the development of national strategies, and so on. So wondering if you could share with the audience some examples of how you did authentic engagement, because bringing people to the table is one thing. Engaging with them and actually having them use their voices is another, which is what I would call the authentic engagement. So if you could each give us an example of how your countries did authentic engagement with autistic people, we'd love to hear it. Who'd like to start?
Okay, thank you. So the most important thing for us was to not just check boxes, because with any law or a national strategy, there's an obligation that has to be submitted for public consultation. But actually, you see this with different strategies across the board, for example, environmental strategies, where there's a rush process sometimes, not saying it's in all different cases, but okay, so we need to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's it. As I mentioned before, it's all about making sure that if it's a strategy for autistic people, but autistic people's lives, okay, so what do autistic people really want? So I would just say, okay, you have to take your time. That was the thing with us. We got some criticism also because the legislation which we had actually passed, I think, said that we should have an actual strategy within 2 years. Yes, it's true that there was the COVID pandemic, like in the meanwhile, which actually like also extended the time frame, but we were also like 1 year over time. However, still, I don't mind the fact that we actually were 1 year over time. There were like no sanctions for that anyway, but it actually gave us time to be able to listen to autistic people. So it was both targeted events. For example, as I mentioned before, we had like town hall meetings. We went to different settings, such as educational settings, but we also like took the time to have one-on-one like meetings, for example, with people who had been in the press because they complained about their experience at hospital or at the airport. So this is the thing. It's a very small country, but then again, what are the specific challenges that autistic people need to be addressed? So it was all about, okay, see who the people are, also see how to get through to them, because then again, it's different people communicated in different ways. as I mentioned, at one point, there were people who used non-traditional communication methods. So we actually made sure that there was a specific session whereby people could also the assistance of a facilitator use like different methods to actually communicate. So identify people, take time, listen to them, draft something, go back, consult again. But then again, this is something which will be there for a time. So it was going to be a 10-year strategy. So why rush it at the beginning? Because, okay, sure, you can always amend things afterwards. But then again, it's all about getting through to people in the ways that work for them. And yeah, like taking as much time as possible to make sure that the voices are really heard.
So the element of time is a key point from what I've heard you say.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, there. There's an element in legislation that actually legislates involvement. I'm from Norway, and for any legislation to be passed, it has to be, one thing is that it has to go through the parliament and all that, but it also has to go on what we call a hearing round, in which all stakeholders, be there people on the spectrum, parents, service providers, schools, whatever, that legislation is impacted, is given, and then we're back to what Alistair is talking about, time to critique the law, to say that, listen, guys, this is not good, or this will cause these problems. And then the law goes back to the parliament and gets rewritten with those comments incorporated or discussed at least before it's brought to the parliament for being passed. Having legislation is one thing. How you actually practice that legislation is a totally different issue, because that's left up to bureaucrats. Now, how to implement things in Norway, that's done by giving for each law, there's a guidance note. And it's mandated that in order to write these guidance notes, you have to have NGOs in that process. So that, for instance, when it comes to diagnostics or the manual for diagnostics, we were invited to be on that panel and managed to actually implement aggressive timelines for the time spent from people think there's a problem till you're finally gotten the diagnosis, shortened in time periods, under the clear understanding that time is of essence for help. So there's a lot of stakeholder engagement in that process. The downside of that is people tend to, or the bureaucrats seems to think that, well, your challenges are so well recognized that we don't really need to pay that much attention to you anymore. So our own success tends to trip us up sometimes.
That's really unfortunate, because when you have it written into legislation, you have the processes there. But there's really no guarantee, as you say, because it's the implementation. That's what it really comes down to. Thank you. What about you, Dr. Daniels?
Yes, so with us, in our legislation, it says that autistic people and family members are to be a part of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. So they are part of the committee that is making the decisions. And then the committee invites public comment on a regular basis. We meet 3 to 4 times a year. And so we hear emerging issues from the public that way. And the committee also hosts panels on topics of interest, and we always ensure that there's representation of autistic individuals and family members. in those discussions on specific topics, for example, we did race and autism in April. And we've done a number of other topics. We did one on aging in the fall of last year. And so we ensure that there's representation in those panels, which usually give the committee ideas on things that they would like to put in the strategic plan or in other documents they're working on. We also sometimes issue requests for information to the public where we're asking a targeted question and inviting public input, and we usually get hundreds of responses to those, and our team carefully analyzes them and presents them back to the committee. So we have a number of different ways that we are able to gauge public input, and I think it's very important to constantly do that as the field is always changing and new ideas are emerging and new needs.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got
Yeah, it's sort of a spin-off of that, and that is, I've mentioned it before, that we need to be able to go back and see what has actually happened in the implementation, like evaluate what happens. In Norway, that takes the form of a white paper, and people with autism are on that on the committee that writes that white paper, which points out that yes, you're doing the right things there, and there, but, and it's always the but that's important.
Oh, okay. So that, you know what, I was going to go to another question, but you've just prompted me to think of something else. And that's the whole issue around accountability. And so how do you get to accountability? Maybe
Okay.
let's start with.
Yes. So first and foremost, I'll also go a step prior to that. So we have mechanisms in place in Malta to actually ensure accountability by disabled people themselves. So be it when it comes to autism legislation or national strategy, but also to wider disability legislation or the strategy. However, even in the design process, apart from consulting people ad hoc, there is also a committee called Engage. It's actually was set up for to Article 4.3 of the UN Convention. And it's basically a committee made up of disabled people from different walks of life, representative of the National Disability Federation, University of Malta's Disability Studies Department, and also the National Disability Regulator. And there's a requirement by law that every strategy, every policy, every law has to go through this committee, which is led and made up of disabled people. By the way, the chair is actually autistic. Also, it's not me, it's another person. But then again, we actually did get some slack for that. But then again, so there's also like an autistic voice represented in there. And that way, we actually make sure that the legislation or the policies in place actually have gone through the sieve of disabled people. But when it actually comes to accountability, we have strived in the past years to ensure the independence of the regulatory authority, which is led by disabled people also. So whenever it comes to monitoring, apart from the fact that Malta has also to answer to the UN every few years, and it's reviewed by the UN, there's also national monitoring by the regulator, so CRPD, Commission for the Rights of Persons with Disability. And they have a specific section which monitors what is going on in terms of different convention articles, in terms of national disability strategy. Also, to make sure that government is held accountable, different stakeholders are held accountable, and it can actually raise relevant matters in this respect. And as I mentioned, the Commission also sits on this Engage committee. So it engages not just about reviewing legislation and policies, it's also about flagging matters. So whenever like the Commission sees that there's an issue, it can first raise it in this committee because there's a government representative on it. If government does not answer, it can actually go public. I mean, it can go public at any point. So this way we have checks and balances. Civil society can also do this. So mentioned as National Disability Federation, but we wrote into our laws checks and balances to make sure that disabled people have the last word when it comes to their rights. It's still a nascent thing. It's like something which is building up, but so far it's worked over the past few months.
Okay, thank you. Would either of you like to address the issue of accountability?
Yeah, I think that's if you have legislation, the next branch that governs that is the legal system. The ability to take legal action for a community not to follow the legislation is a very powerful tool. you will say, like, you look at a legislation and say, okay, it says we should do this, this, and this. To what level all of these issues are being addressed, how much service, how much you get for this is up to interpretation. But the fact that you can go to the courts and have their say on whether or not what the community is providing is sufficient according to the law is a very powerful tool. So you can't look at legislation and the courts as not being connected.
They're very connected. Yes.
So two different layers for us on accountability are that, as I mentioned, our federal agencies and departments are on the committee. And so they are there listening to what is shared by public members and shared by the public, and they're able to answer questions. They've definitely heard every discussion that has happened there, and they're able to take information directly back to their agencies from these meetings, but also they are part of forming that strategic plan. And so that gives them some accountability. And our laws cycle about every 5 years. And so our Autism Cares Act will be reauthorized in 2024. And every time we have a reauthorization cycle, Congress comes back to find out what's happened. And they ask for a lot of information from the agencies about what has been implemented. And Congress thinks about what else might be needed to be added to the law. So that's how the law evolves over time. So that's another layer of accountability.
Excellent. Thank you.
Just go
More
to
to add?
I'll add something to what Harold actually mentioned earlier. And this was also like mentioned now as regards the legal system. So Harold earlier mentioned access to justice. So yes, it's important that you have the right to go to court. But then again, how accessible is that? And we all know that for the autistic person, I mean, just a few weeks ago, I actually had a meltdown because the court building was too crowded. I got overwhelmed. So then again, what we did, like in Malta, when it comes to smaller claims, we have a system of UNCRPD redress panels. So instead of actually having to go to the courts, to the main civil courts, which also entails like expenses, first of all. Secondly, it's a very old procedure, which dates from the British era, which was the laws were not updated since then. So instead, like, for example, if you use non-traditional communication methods, you can actually use those. If you want to actually have the procedure in writing instead of like orally, you can have that also. So we should set up these panels. So with the bulk of cases, which are, let's say, small claims, for example, a kid did not actually get support, educational support at school, or there was a workplace discrimination, but it was not a matter which actually would be within the courts, kind of something which you could go all the way to court with. Then you have these panels which can actually regulate their own procedure in line with the convention. Then again, the court system is still available, and it should still obviously be aligned with the precepts of the UN Convention. But let's say there's a lot of people who are used to the status quo within the judicial system. It will take much more time to actually change. So it's important to, yes, have legal redress mechanisms, but also have accessible redress mechanisms. Otherwise, it's just there on paper. It's useless.
Yes. We don't need more useless legislation. So that accountability piece is very important. It was fascinating listening to the three of you present on your country's framework for autism. And many people, many advocates in this room have been advocating for a national framework in Canada for many, many years, with the hope and expectation and the belief that it would make a difference. And we'd like to hear the benefit of your experience as to whether or not it makes a difference on the ground. And I think you've mentioned, you've highlighted or reinforced the fact that, you know, autism and people on the autism spectrum, autistic individuals, multi-dimensional. It's a spectrum, you know, the needs vary. But for people on the autism spectrum, for autistic people in this country, for people in this room who want to know, what difference does a national framework make to people's everyday lives in terms of health and well-being and access to services?
Okay.
I'll start at the other end of the panel this time.
Norway does not have a current autism strategy plan, whatever. We did have one, was it last century, which had a major impact. First of all, in the 1980s, 1990s, autism was still regarded as a rare condition. And also, people tended to look at autism from a singular facet point of view, not multi-dimensional. At that point, Norway implemented what we call the autism program. And the main impact on that is a better understanding of what autism is, what services people with autism needs. And particularly for that program, the impact of comorbidity in autism. Autism and blind people, autism and deaf people, autism and epilepsy, which at that point generated what we called a network of expert institutions who was tasked with gathering the information, organizing it, and bringing it out to the local communities, which has resulted in the fact that, for instance, on education, the understanding of the multi-solution ways of setting up a teaching environment for people with autism has been much better understood. Unfortunately, that understanding tends to not extend to the people on the spectrum that it has good academic skills and has good language and the understanding that the problems are still the same in that setting. But for the ones without any language, with very complex needs, it has definitely highlighted what a good system should look like. And it makes it a lot easier to go to discuss with the school boards about what your child needs. So it gives it this individual element of the education.
So that you're creating conditions for every child to succeed. Yes. Dr. Daniels?
So for us, we have the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee and its strategic plan, and both have made a difference in how autism work is happening on the ground. With the committee, as I've described, it's a dynamic committee that's constantly bringing in emerging issues from the grassroots as people share with us. And even discussions in committee before they're able to be put into a document are able to influence our federal agencies to modify their programs and address gaps in needs. And when some of those end up in a strategic plan, the strategic plan is a really strong, solid foundation for federal agencies to be able to either develop new programs or modify existing programs to really meet the needs of autistic people. And 3 areas that I can give as examples where this has made a difference are co-occurring conditions. As you talked about, back in 2009, there was some question about whether this was a real phenomenon. We had people from the community sharing that they were experiencing co-occurring conditions, and others in the community that said, no, it's really the brain, it's not physical body and other aspects of health that are affected. But with the committee's work on this, research was funded, not just because of the committee. I mean, committee was an important part of spurring on research on co-occurring conditions, but now more than a decade and a half later, we know that these conditions are affecting autistic individuals, and this is now trickled down to the medical community, and they're aware as well. We need to work more on more awareness, but they are aware that autistic individuals experience these and need assistance with those conditions. But other issues include law enforcement, and in our committee, we had a mother who spoke about her child who unfortunately had passed away after wandering away from safety, and the difficulty that law enforcement had finding her child and not having training for how to deal with children who might be wandering away from safety, and that they have different responses to people that might be looking for them. And so with those discussions that we had in our committee over several years and recommendations in the strategic plan, that's contributed to now we have across our nation more training in law enforcement across the country for people to understand people with autism or people with many different disabilities who may have interactions with law enforcement and how to be appropriate with that.
That's if I could just jump in, I'm sorry. That's a huge issue, that interaction with law enforcement and autistic people in Canada. And if there's any advice you could give us in this country as to how we can better work with law enforcement to do better in community when there are interactions, because that's a huge issue.
It is a huge issue, and our Department of Justice is now a part of our committee, which has been a huge, boon to the committee to have them there, and they're very active. We have a special law too called Kevin Advante's law that is for finding missing individuals, including individuals on the autism spectrum specifically, and this has provided grants to police departments across the country to innovate and develop programs for training law enforcement professionals. And so that's been a huge help, but certainly I'm happy to share more information about that or connect you with our Department of Justice if you have questions. They're doing a fantastic job of trying to get this information out. And we know that policing overall is so important to health and safety of individuals.
I have a feeling that might come up during the lunch conversations.
Sorry, Alistair, just a spin off again.
To spin off on the justice.
Yeah,
Yes, okay.
because it's not just the justice. Well, Alistair pointed to the fact that there's barriers to actually access the justice system. But this also affects, for instance, firefighters. How do you clear a building during a fire when somebody doesn't react like everybody else? So it is a much wider issue than just policing. It's any services from the public, really, that gets affected by this. And you mentioned one thing that I keep coming back to: the financing for teaching and training people in these issues. There needs to be financing.
Thank you for giving us the broader context around that.
So actually, I will link into what the other speakers have mentioned. In general, I guess the main thing for a country like Malta especially was not only allowing coordination, but we are, although we're a very small country, we're obsessed with silos and territoriality. Like it is a very small country, but like in the past, okay, so disability used to fall within the remit of the Social Affairs Ministry. Now it's from the remit of the Inclusion Ministry. But let's say you had to do something in the area of education or the area of health. You actually find a lot of walls up just going to another ministry. The reason that now having the Autism Advisory Council, the same way that like the US has IAC, actually created a focal point. So very recently, and also linked to the element of training here, were approached by the Department of Health Policy within the Health Ministry, not because we were the Inclusion Ministry, but because we were the Autism Advisory Council. Mentioning this pediatric one-stop shop project that I mentioned earlier, and saying, okay, we actually need your advice in how to actually design matters also in a sensorially accessible manner, but also to train our staff, because many people actually don't really, have been doctors, for example, for many, many years, and don't really get all of the ins and outs of autism. This would not have been possible in the past. So, I mean, the fact that there's this focal point has helped. But linking to training, this is one of the main elements, because we have tried to have disability sensitivity trainings in the past in Malta. But unfortunately, it was all about checking boxes. Do this, don't do this, be nice to disabled people. I mean, that's from yesteryear, basically. At this point, it's all about, first of all, involving disabled people, autistic people in that training, and secondly, sensitizing people. So we've actually seen that when it came to the medical community, it all started from, there was an incident a few months back, but I'm going into many details. So chloral hydrate was actually being prescribed as a sleep aid to 3-year-old autistic kids. And that was kind of raised some concerns. However, like the prescribing doctor did this very genuinely. So we're like, okay, instead of going down the reporting route, let's engage with the Pediatrics Association and let's actually have a training on, okay, what is like autism? Okay, so necessary pharmacological elements, necessary medical elements, and always tailor this to your audience. Because one of the issues with training always in the past in Malta was we had like one PowerPoint, we're going to use it with everyone. This is the beauty of actually coordination among different entities. If I'm going to actually present about autism to the legal community, lawyers, judges, I'm going to have one specific focus. Present to doctors is not a specific focus. So training is very important, because at the end of the day, okay, some people will not want to budge because it's a status quo. Some people generally don't know. We actually had it like a few years back with, then it was the vice chair of the Department of Pediatrics at our main hospital saying, oh, so like, I mean, autism is not just a kid's thing. And this was a person who was he was a pediatric surgeon by profession, a really good person. But then again, he genuinely just thought that autism was this childhood thing. So it's important. And just like one little thing about autism and the law, actually, National Autistic Society in the UK had done some really good trainings. There was this person who was a police officer. She was also autistic and was involved in this. I can actually check and follow up with that. But definitely, I know that in the US, you're like doing a lot of work with this. But it might be good to also like reach out to the NAS, because I know they've actually done things specifically with law enforcement, like in this respect. So it might be useful to also look into that.
Thank you. I'm trying to think about where to go next, thinking about how much time we have left. I think I want to go to a discussion around intersectionality. Intersectionality is something that I've been paying attention to for a number of years, and it's challenging. We talk about inclusion and acceptance and awareness, but we also know that there are also issues around exclusion, and sometimes that exclusion comes in many different forms. And so I wonder if you could tell us how your country has addressed intersectionality in your autism strategy development, but also in the implementation of your work around autism. How have you specifically addressed and paid attention to issues of intersectionality?
So with the Maltese National Autism Strategy, intersectionality is mentioned like across all different chapters. Okay, being mentioned and being implemented are two different things, as we've been discussing also. But then again, it is important to both look, first of all, at the medical side. Harold mentioned co-occurring conditions before. So there's always like the issue that, okay, but not just be autistic, might be autistic and ADHD. So that in itself already requires a different approach. But then again, there's the issue of women and girls being like diagnosed or underdiagnosed. There's also like the issue of gender affirming care. For example, there's like the gender well-being clinic. What about like trans people who are also autistic? We have specific procedures in place in Malta for that. It's actually written into our strategy. Also, when it actually comes to people from minority groups, so like in Malta, okay, it's traditional homogenous country, but especially over the last years, because we've opened up more and more to the world. There's been an influx of people from many different like areas. And then again, there's like lots of double discrimination, like that's being experienced by these people. And unfortunately, it's bad enough, so to say, that a person has to deal with societal barriers because they're autistic, when they're actually autistic, a person of color, and also queer, for example, then you've really hit the jackpot, as I would say, like, but in a really bad way. So unfortunately, there are like these challenges. We are working also with our counterparts, for example, the Human Rights Directorate, to try and like address these matters. It's very important to have civil society on board, because like with civil society, I always believe and still believe that it is like the main driver. There are procedures in place, there is reporting in place, let's say, as regards fulfilling of relevant actions, both in the autism strategy and national disability strategy. But then again, it's all about societal perceptions. And one thing which I feel is a big issue, at least in Malta, is this, because yes, you have to have people on board, let's say, from society in general, but sometimes autistic people themselves are disempowered, and they don't do enough to empower these people, because how can you actually expect people to fight the good fight if we're not like really empowering those people? So intersectionality is important, but then again, are we actually creating leaders, are we actually creating multipliers? And that's a big like concern. And in Malta, definitely much more has to be done. We have it on paper, but it's not happening in real life yet.
Thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Daniels.
So, yes, so there are two layers I could talk about with this. The strategic plan that we have for the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee has always had some emphasis on intersectionality from the first strategic plan in 2009. But in this latest version, as I mentioned, we have even emphasized it more, as our entire country now is really more focused on these types of issues. And so we have reflected that with entire sections of our strategic plan that are devoted to this. And we're going to be doing more tracking of intersectionality with, women, girls, LGBTQIA+, people from different races, cultures, ethnicities, rural and urban populations, et cetera. So there are a lot of different types of intersectionality that we're going to be looking at. And this is a focus across the entire federal government as well. Our programming across all federal agencies has more of a focus in this area. We have a theme, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, or DEIA, that is across the entire federal government. And something that people who are working on autism and disabilities, I think, are doing in our roles in this space is trying to ensure that neurodiversity and autism and intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities are considered as a part of DEIA, and not just in the accessibility portion, but in the DEI as well, the diversity, equity, and inclusion, that all people with disabilities and neurodivergent individuals need to be considered as a part of our nation's diversity and be included in equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs. So we're really pleased that the entire federal government is committed to this, and hope that as these programs emerge and develop, that they will be fully inclusive of people with disabilities.
So a cross-government approach. I wonder if you could say a bit more. You mentioned earlier in response to a different question about a recent event you had on race and autism. Can you tell us a bit more about that event and what the purpose was and the outcome?
Yeah, so we at the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, we usually have different sections of the meeting, including usually a panel on some type of issue that the committee is really interested in. And we've addressed race and autism a couple of times. Actually, the first meeting of this new cohort that came in July 2021, we had just an open discussion with the entire committee about race and autism, which was enlightening. And this time for our April meeting, we hosted a discussion with 3 researchers who presented some of the research on race and autism. And then we had 4 panelists, 2 autistic individuals and 2 parent advocates, who talked about specific issues from their communities, including tribal communities, Hispanic and Latino communities, the African American community, and some of the issues they're facing, and also the innovative programming that they're putting in place to serve those communities. And we had a robust discussion on this issue, and the committee is highly energized around intersectionality and hopes to continue working on that through the rest of their term.
Thank you.
And in intersectionality is again multi-leveled. Are we talking girls autism, race autism, or are we talking the individual services?
All of the above.
Yeah. No, it's
As
sort
our
of-
friend has said, it's the jackpot,
yeah.
right?
I think the easiest answer to that is we've taken that problem and dropped it onto the floor to where the problem actually exists. The Scandinavian countries has traditionally had a very good understanding of all of these issues in terms of a broader element, albeit race hasn't been a very much an issue in the Scandinavian countries. They're we're slightly homogeneous, put it that way. But what we've done in terms of intersectionality and is looking at the fact that you need help from multiple providers, health, social, education, and we've dropped that down to the individual and says, okay, you've gotten a diagnosis. That entitles you to an individual plan on how to receive your help. And it's not just an individual approach. You as the individual is actually in charge of defining what you want. So for instance, in an education setting, you know that you really don't want to be part of physical education because those tends to be loud and a lot of action and it's stressful. So you can say, I don't want to be part of that. You can say, I need a different approach to housing. This is what my goal for my home is going to be. How do we deal with that? And in doing that, you pinpoint which services you're going to need to achieve that. i.e., you're going to need help from a physiotherapist. You're going to need help from somebody in the community that can provide financing for what you're doing. You're going to need help from getting from A to B. And all of these services comes from different providers. And there's, you get a coordinator tasked with coordinating all of these needs for you particular.
So in this country, we might call that something like a wraparound service. And are you saying that in Norway that happens for all folks who?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, wonderful. Because I don't think it happens for everyone here. I think it's a lot of advocacy, a lot of fighting, a lot of pushing. I know in my own family, for people who don't know, my youngest grandson, who's 11, is autistic, and his older brother, who's 13, is also neurodiverse. And so you can imagine our household and some of the challenges, and it's very, very challenging. It's very, very challenging. And like many people in this room, you know, our family has advocated for better services, for actually having a voice in terms of even identifying what services you need. Who's the best advocate? You know, the people that are living with, the people who are living with autistic individuals, or autistic individuals themselves, right? Know what they need. And so I know our time is going to be coming to a close very shortly. So I want to ask one final question of each of you. As Canada is embarking on establishing a national strategy, if you were to give us one major bit of advice, what is the one compelling thing based on lessons learned? And I strongly believe that our best lessons are learned from the mistakes we make, when we can critically analyze those mistakes and not repeat them. So based on your analysis of what's worked and what hasn't worked in your country, what advice do you have for Canada as we move forward with this new development of establishing a framework? Maybe we'll have you go first.
All right.
So-
So my advice would be, if you're forming an advisory committee to help develop the strategic plan, that you are very intentional about being inclusive of different portions of the community and ensuring there's adequate representation of many different groups, many different voices, people from across many of these intersectional communities, to have them there as a part of the decision-making. And I would also recommend having policymakers who are involved actually a part of the committee, because that again provides more accountability. If they're there, they can't say they haven't heard what is being shared, and they have more of an ability to take information right back to their agency quickly in case there's something that they might want to implement sooner, rather than waiting for however long it takes to get your first strategy out. There sometimes are actionable pieces that can be implemented quickly. And so having them there as a part of that accountability and making it a collaborative process. Something else to just be mindful of is that in any of these kinds of situations, and you have people with a variety of viewpoints, that it will involve some compromise, and that people cannot stand in their separate corners and not come to the middle on some levels. So you have to find things to agree upon so that you can move forward and continue working on the areas that are difficult to find agreement on, but to keep the process moving, to try to identify what you all can agree on so that you can move forward in a timely fashion.
How do you get to that point? Like, is there a magic kind of process to get to that point?
Well, when in our committee meetings, if we're starting to get very polarized, I know that I and Dr. Gordon, who's the chair of the committee and the director of National Institute of Mental Health, both provide reminders to the committee that we are looking to achieve consensus so that we can move forward. And so we encourage people to be respectful in their dialogue, and that we expect disagreement. There are just so many diverse points of view, but we ask people often to be respectful and to work toward getting to solutions. And we want to hear about the problems, but at the same time, our goal is to get to some kinds of solutions that can be helpful. And if it's not a perfect solution, it's okay. We can still start moving forward with maybe a not completely perfect solution, and then continue perfecting it.
So getting to consensus, having diversity at the table, having a commitment to working with that diversity, having those voices heard, and having a willingness to move forward, even if it's not exactly what you were hoping for in the beginning. Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. Who'd like to go next?
Okay, so one thing which I would say we would have done differently in Malta would be the issue of the implementation plan. So as I mentioned before, it's important for stakeholders to have ownership. So when we actually approved the document, we made sure that the different entities represented on the Autism Advisory Council all signed off on the plan. But then again, you have specific actions, and even if we knew that, for example, the actions related to health would be mostly the health ministry, or the actions related to education would be mostly the education ministry, would be the lead on them, it would have been useful to, okay, have kept the autism strategy as a simple document accessible to everyone, but having the implementation plan also agreed around about the same time, because then it actually delayed us. Okay, I mean, now we're actually on track, we're implementing different actions. But when it actually comes to the nuts and bolts, it can actually take time, because there's different departments within different ministries, different entities. So what I would say is this: Make sure you have something workable, make sure you have ownership, but also make sure that the nuts and bolts are cleared out beforehand. So once you hit the ground, you hit the ground running and you have a workable plan, because every, let's say, minute, every hour, every day actually lose is actually a day lost for autistic people and their families.
So you've really highlighted the issue of time
Yeah, again.
and time management. So that seems to be a real critical piece.
I mean, we are Mediterraneans at the end of the day, but I mean, but still, yeah, it's important. So.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
I don't know if there is a single good advice to what you're doing. I would think that education, and I'm not talking going to school and stuff like that, but educating society to what we're looking at. That's not an easy task to get an understanding of, make sure that society has an understanding of the complexity of autism, of the numerous elements that you need to consider, and the fact that everything plays together. So if there is one sort of thing, I would think that make it a living organism. You're not going to solve all problems over the next 2 years, but solve some of them and then change focus and move on to the next one. Consult with the autistic community to find out where the problem is most hurting right now. Focus on that, fix that, move on.
Mhm.
Change the flexibility of a plan. We've learned, we think we know that people with autism are rigid and need structure. But as a society, we need to be flexible in order to accommodate that. And I think that's my one advice: make sure it is flexible.
So making sure it's flexible and making sure it's the living organism, I heard you say, and how important that is. So that's a continuous kind of evaluation loop.
We started out that way in Norway, and we came to the point where there is no need for an autism strategy because it's been implemented in other legal documents, like the social legislation, like the educational legislation, like the health legislation. So it's pinpointing what is the problem right now.
Right. And how best to address it.
If I might.
Oh, yes.
just,
Go ahead.
just, intervene on this. I know it's a bit of a pain point, maybe for some people, but in Malta, we actually got a lot of slack as the autistic community because the only two, let's say, disability categories which get special treatment, so to say, that way, are the autistic community and the deaf community. So we have legislation and we have our own councils or strategies. However, there's a reason for that. And there is a reason why more and more countries are having autism strategies. Because yes, it's true. If you look at Malta's national disability strategy and national autism strategy, like the same points that are there in the national disability strategy are all covered in the national autism strategy. The difference is this. First of all, there's more of an angle in the national autism strategy. Second, it's about implementation, reporting, and taking responsibility. Because at the end of the day, it's one thing, for example, reaching out to employers and saying, yes, let's make your services, let's make your work environment more disability friendly. But then again, we actually know that with autism, like there's so much misunderstanding of autism. I mean, there's so many gray areas. I mean, it's one thing of making sure that the person like who uses a wheelchair can actually get to work, gets to their office every day. It's another thing like seeing all of the autistic people fall through the cracks. So what I would say is this, that yes, I am aware that like in Scandinavian countries, many countries maybe, they have got their act in order when it comes to certain things, but with autism, it's such a funny animal, if I put it that way. It's such a sui generis, complex phenomenon that at the end of the day, you have to address it like very specifically. So I would say yes, national autism strategies are required, be it in Canada, be it in Malta, be it in the US, be it anywhere else, just because you will never ever get certain things sorted out through a national disability strategy, national disability legislation, and also the element of consultation. If you actually have a national disability strategy, you will consult all kinds of disabled people. With the national autism strategy, you have to consult autistic people. And as we always say, you've met one autistic person, only met one autistic person. I mean, there's so much diversity on the spectrum, and like our needs like change and fluctuate. So I would say, no, maybe I'm being biased. And other disability groups say, okay, you guys are getting special treatment, but no, we need that special treatment, if we put it that way, just because you guys don't know what our lot is, but everyone in this room knows what our lot is. So congratulations to Canada for having the strategy. And I do believe that we do need autism strategies, like in other countries also, over and above disability strategies, disability legislation. And it's my personal point of view, but I feel very strongly about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's been really fascinating to go deeper on a lot of these issues with you. And I'm sure that it's going to help us a lot in this country as we move forward with the development of our framework, a national strategy, and ultimately, it's about helping individuals achieve their full potential, no matter where they are, no matter who they are. So I thank you for your time and your commitment, your leadership, and for helping us understand your respective countries' work in this area a little bit better. Thank you. And I'm going to hand it back.
Wow, I am just blown away and absolutely inspired. You have all shown us that coordination amongst complex systems is actually possible, that listening is possible, that collaboration is possible, and that meaningful engagement is possible. So again, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for sharing. I will invite everyone during lunch to submit any questions you may have for our guests on Slido. There's a slide and a QR code there. You can access that during lunch. We'll have a break now, and thank you again.